In the final days of December 1902, an early snowstorm fell over Baltimore with an unnatural silence, pressing down like a weight from the heavens. It was not just heavy with snow, it was heavy with something else, something older, colder, and unseen. The city shivered and slowed, but in the forest just north of town, at the edge of the trees where the sky dimmed too early and the wind never stopped whispering, Rosewood Asylum was already preparing for isolation. The staff shut the gates 4 days before New Year's Eve. Supplies were tallied, horses were stalled, telegraph lines began to fail, no one was allowed in and no one left. It was a place built for the forgotten, buried under the name of care. The records describe Rosewood as a facility of modern medicine and moral treatment, a progressive phrase used often in the early 20th century, where torture had simply been renamed therapy. Hidden behind whitewashed walls and tall iron fences, Rosewood promised a future free of superstition. But this was a performance, carefully rehearsed. In truth, the asylum was neither medical nor spiritual. It was a cold box for unwanted lives, sealed by paperwork and justified by fear. The patients inside, most of them poor, many of them children or the elderly, were listed as having nervous disorders, hysteria, or the vague term imbecility. These were not diagnoses. These were excuses. Once entered into Rosewood, a person belonged to silence. In the first week of the storm, that silence grew thick. By the 4th day, temperatures had dropped below zero. The outer gates were hidden under 4 feet of snow. Visitors stopped trying to approach the facility. Inside, lantern oil ran low and candles were rationed. A sense of hunger stirred, not just physical but psychological. One nurse later wrote, "The walls were breathing and time no longer passed." Then, without alarm, without struggle, the first patient disappeared. Her name was Annabelle Cray, age 17. She had been committed by her father after the death of her younger brother. Her chart was clean, no signs of violence, no resistance to routine. But on the 5th morning, her bed was found empty, the sheets tucked as if undisturbed, her restraints neatly folded at the foot. There was no window in her room, and the door had been locked from the outside. No one could explain how she was gone. No search was ordered. The entry in the logbook simply read, "Patient transferred." There was no record of where. That night, 2 more patients vanished, then 4, then 7. No screams were reported, no breakage. Just the same pattern, neatly folded restraints, undisturbed beds, nothing taken. Some staff began to whisper about secret exits. Others blamed madness, but no evidence supported either. A growing dread swallowed the halls, but administration offered no public statement. The head physician, Dr. Ackerley, reportedly locked himself in his office for 36 hours before emerging with reddened eyes and hands that trembled as he wrote. By the end of the 7th night, 27 patients had vanished. Every one of them had been marked nonviolent. All had been residents for over 6 months. All had recently undergone a new procedure, though the files contained only vague references to harmonic exposure and spatial induction. Staff members began to resign, some claiming illness, others simply disappearing themselves. The asylum continued to operate, but something beneath its floorboards had shifted. Official inquiries were conducted months later when the snow melted and the roads reopened. The reports were clinical, filled with denials and contradictions. Family members received typed letters stating that their loved ones had been relocated to other facilities due to overcapacity. No records were attached. The transfer logs were falsified. Names appeared without signatures. Some were dated after the supposed departures. When archivists attempted to trace the missing patients years later, they found a single red envelope inside the state hospital registry. No stamp, no seal, just a handwritten phrase scrawled across the front in pencil. Marked for transfer, Never received. Inside were 27 names listed with birth dates, no exit date, no burial, no cause of death. Just one word stamped in black beside each name: vanished. To this day, there is no formal acknowledgement of the disappearances at Rosewood Asylum. No charges, no memorial. Only dust-covered ledgers, censored reports, and patient records sealed under legal protections. What happened inside those walls during those 4 nights has never been explained. But those who've studied the case long enough come to a quiet conclusion. It wasn't a mistake. It wasn't a failure of oversight. It was a design. And behind that design was a signature long buried, one that would appear again, hidden in the footnotes of journals, in surgical diagrams never published, in the locked cabinets of forgotten hospitals across the country. A man who had been removed from practice a year earlier. A man who was not supposed to be there. A man named Dr. Lucian Graymarch. And just as the snow had closed in, so too did the silence. But some silences are not empty. Some carry screams, so deep and precise they become part of the walls. The chapter ends, but the story only deepens. Dr. Lucian Graymarch arrived at Rosewood as if he had always belonged there. To the patients, he seemed kind, almost saintly, a man who smiled often and carried himself with a calm that made him appear above suspicion. His voice was soft, his step quiet, and he greeted the afflicted as though he were greeting family. But his name was not on the official registry. His medical license had been revoked a year earlier after accusations that he had experimented on children in a Philadelphia ward. The charges never reached court. The records vanished, sealed under the explanation of professional rivalry. By the winter of 1902, Graymarch had been erased from public life. Yet here he was again, walking the halls of Rosewood, tucked into the papers under another physician's name. No one questioned him because no one dared. He was too precise, too educated, too convincing. He had the air of authority that ordinary men obey without thought. To the staff, he appeared as a reformist, a modern thinker who spoke of healing not through restraint but through understanding. He promised that suffering could be lessened if one could identify the root of fracture in a patient's memory. He spoke of harmony, of aligning the nervous system like tuning a musical instrument. Many nurses admired him at first, repeating his words in their journals. But the admiration slowly turned to unease. He had a habit of looking into people too long, as though staring through their faces, measuring not what they said, but how much they feared being measured. Some wrote that he seemed to pulse with life one moment and vanish into emptiness the next. A man standing in the room without truly being there. What was never admitted aloud was the fact that Graymarch believed pain was not an accident of treatment, but the key to truth itself. He insisted that the human mind carried hidden compartments, locked away behind shame, and that only controlled agony could unlock them. He told a nurse in passing that the nervous system was a confessional booth and that every cry revealed not suffering but the soul's testimony. When questioned about his methods, he would simply smile, as if they were too complicated for lesser minds to grasp. His innocence was a mask that invited trust while he quietly took whatever he wanted. 3 days before the storm, staff journals describe him performing what he called audits. He would call patients into his office one by one and take careful notes while asking questions that had little to do with medicine. He wanted to know their earliest memories of guilt. He asked about drowned pets, stolen food, dead siblings. He studied their reactions with a surgeon's patience, cataloging every flicker of shame. One nurse wrote that he was less interested in answers than in watching how long it took for a patient to stop resisting. When she asked him why he was conducting these sessions, he told her it was for a new therapy. But she noticed that he never requested attendants to be present. He preferred the doors locked. Stranger still, he demanded records of staff as well. He began interrogating orderlies, cooks, and cleaners under the same pretense of psychological balance. Several refused only to find their names missing from the roster days later. In one account, an orderly recalled that Greymarch asked him how often he dreamt of drowning, then stared at him silently for nearly an hour, writing nothing. The man left the room shaking, unable to explain why the silence had felt more violent than words. It was not until the storm closed Rosewood off from the outside world that Greymarch's authority became absolute. The head physician was overwhelmed, most nurses were exhausted, and communication lines were frozen. In the fog of crisis, Greymarch's voice became the only steady voice. He wrote reports, approved transfers, signed off on medical decisions. He appeared indispensable, the one man calm in the chaos. But when investigators later pieced through the files, they found something that made no sense. His signature appeared on transfer forms for all 27 vanished patients, even though his own employment record had officially ended 3 days earlier. He was not supposed to be in the asylum at all. Yet he had written his name over and over again, moving the lost patients into a ledger that pointed to nowhere. The final entry tied to his hand was not in the transfer records, but in a nurse's private journal. She had been assigned to bring him supplies late one evening, when she overheard him speaking quietly in his office. She could not make out the words, but she wrote that his tone was not one of conversation but of instruction, as though he was reciting commands to an unseen student. On his desk, she saw a written request submitted to the workshop. 27 wax models of the patient's heads required for medical imaging purposes. No one questioned the order. The request was signed. The wax was delivered. And though the storm raged outside, within Rosewood a different storm was beginning. One that did not fall from the sky but rose from a single man's hidden design. The silence of the vanished patients was no longer the only silence to fear. There was also the silence of a doctor who should not have been there at all. And it was a silence that would soon speak in ways too cruel to imagine. The vanishings did not unfold in chaos but in order, like the ticking of a clock. Each loss came between the hours of 2 and 4 in the morning, when the corridors were at their quietest, and the outside storm pressed hardest against the walls. There were no screams, no alarms, no broken locks. The rooms remained undisturbed except for one detail repeated with surgical precision. The leather restraints, which should have bound the patients through the night, were always cut through cleanly and folded back onto the bed as if placed by careful hands. To the casual eye, it suggested nothing more than an orderly transfer. To the trained eye, it was a sign of ritual, deliberate and practiced. The asylum surveillance was primitive, relying on logs kept by nurses and guards. Yet those very logs revealed gaps that mirrored the vanishings. At the exact hours when patients disappeared, staff names were missing from the record, their tasks left blank. Some claimed they had been reassigned. Others swore they had been resting. But every entry seemed to bend around one fact. Dr. Lucian Greymarch was always listed as observing or resting at those moments, his absence protected by a word too vague to prove, too solid to challenge. It was as if the official hand of the asylum had turned itself away so he could work unseen. By the third night, the staff had begun to break. Several nurses resigned under the pretense of illness. One orderly walked off into the storm and never returned. Yet one woman stayed. Her name was Elva May, a nurse whose letters to her sister survive in fragments. She wrote that something was happening in the West Wing, that patients were being chosen according to a list she had never seen, and that every single one of them had undergone Greymarch's therapy exactly 3 weeks before they vanished. She described him watching the halls at night, silent, with a lantern that never seemed to flicker, moving as if his body had no weight. Elva May's last entry was dated the morning after the fourth disappearance. She said she planned to confront him, to check the records herself, but she never had the chance. On the fifth night, her own bed was found empty, her uniform folded at the chair, her restraints cut the same way as the patient's. She was never seen again, and so the silence deepened, growing heavier with each absence, until it was no longer the storm that made the nights unbearable, but the certainty that someone inside was guiding the dark. With his own hidden clock, in 1956, long after Rosewood had begun to crumble into ruin, workers clearing the foundation of the West Wing struck a wall that did not belong. Behind it lay a sealed chamber, untouched for over half a century. The air was stale and sour, heavy with the faint smell of wax and rust. At the center of the room sat a surgical chair bolted into the floor, its leather straps rotted but still locked in position. Beside it, a phonograph stood waiting, its horn tilted upward as though it had been listening. Stacked in cabinets along the walls were hundreds of unmarked wax cylinders, their surfaces dulled with dust. What was found inside them would tell more than the walls ever could. Archivists who attempted to play the cylinders described the sounds as unbearable. Most were filled with piercing static, the kind of noise that claws into the ear and refuses to leave. But layered inside, some of them were faint traces of human sound, gasps, choked sobs, the low repetition of single words. On one recording, a trembling voice whispered again and again, "I remember now." On another, a man's voice moaned for nearly a minute before cutting off with a sudden click, as if a hand had silenced him. These were not medical notes. They were confessions forced into sound, fragments of memory stripped out and sealed in wax. It became clear that Greymarch had not been treating patients at all. He had been harvesting their memories, pulling them apart under the illusion of therapy. His method was simple in theory, but cruel in practice. He would hypnotize a patient until they drifted into the fragile space between sleep and waking, then expose them to unbearable physical pain while his voice guided them back to their earliest memories of guilt. The phonograph recorded every sound, creating an archive of broken confessions. He believed that suffering could dig deeper than reason, that agony itself could tear open the mind and force the soul to speak truths it had buried. The chair was not built for comfort. It was built to hold the body still while the memory was cut out piece by piece. In his journals, later recovered from hidden shelves, Greymarch wrote that guilt was the single disease of humanity, and that it left stains on the body invisible to ordinary eyes. He claimed that by capturing the voice of a patient at the peak of pain, he was bottling the guilt itself, storing it like a specimen. He called this process cleansing. He argued that once the memory had been extracted, the patient would be empty, freed of the burden, ready to be rewritten into innocence. Yet the cylinders proved the opposite. The voices inside were not relieved. They were desperate, pleading, still conscious even as the recordings ended. What he called freedom was only erasure. The victims were not random, as the state had once suggested. Every one of them had been chosen for what they remembered. They were the quiet ones, the survivors of private tragedies. The patients who carried histories that no one else could prove. A dead sibling, a drowned child, an accident never spoken of. Greymarch catalogued these hidden wounds, then sought to drag them out in his chamber. He believed he was building a library of humanity's sins, stored not in books but in voices carved into wax. To him, the screams were not cries of pain but data. They were the purest form of truth. Decades later, when the recordings were analyzed by sound engineers, one detail unsettled them most. Between the human voices and the static, a faint rhythm pulsed, steady and measured like the ticking of a hidden clock. No one could explain whether it was a flaw in the phonograph or something Greymarch had created himself. Some speculated that he had used the rhythm to synchronize his hypnosis, to pull the victims into obedience while he tore their memories away. Others wondered if the sound was not mechanical at all, but the trace of something living, something that had been left behind when the mind was emptied. The room was resealed after the discovery, the cylinders boxed and hidden in a state archive where they remain locked. But the sound itself, once heard, is impossible to forget. The workers who stumbled into the chamber carried the memory of it until their deaths. They all said the same thing. The screams were still there, unheard by the world, but alive in the wax, waiting to be played again. And for those who knew Greymarch's hand, it was proof that his work had not been madness alone. It was deliberate, methodical, and patient. It was the silence of evil disguised as science. And it was only the beginning of what he called his greater design. The official files of the vanished 27 patients told a comforting story. Each was labeled non-violent, passive, incapable of harm. Their diagnoses were vague: melancholia, nervous exhaustion, mild retardation. Chosen words meant to suggest harmless souls who posed no danger to others. In the asylum's language, they were the safest bodies to confine, easy to manage, destined to live and die quietly. Yet hidden in the locked drawer of Greymarch's desk, investigators later found a second record, a red leather ledger that rewrote their identities with chilling precision. In that book, he had given each patient a new title, not of illness, but of hidden purpose. Where the files said passive, the ledger said vessel. Where the files said harmless, he wrote fractured. The ledger was not a set of notes, but a system, a code that only Greymarch understood. For each patient, he drew diagrams, sketched heads, torsos, hands, then added annotations in a script that grew tighter and more fevered with every page. Next to one name, he wrote, "Holds the memory, fractured at age 9. Another read, "Keeps the guilt of fire, scar runs inside." One drawing of a young boy carried a chilling caption, "Contains the scream of the drowned." These were not medical records. They were maps of suffering. He believed trauma left behind patterns etched into the body like scars unseen by the eye, and his task was to locate and play them like notes on an instrument. Greymarch's theory was that suffering did not fade but crystallized. A beating, a betrayal, a prayer unanswered. Each wound left behind a shape, what he called spiritual architecture. To him, trauma was not a wound, but a design, an unfinished structure waiting to be completed. He saw himself not as a doctor, but as the builder who could finish the structure and reveal its true form. The 27 were not chosen at random. They had all survived religious tragedy or war's shadow. Children who had watched churches burn, women who had seen brothers drown in rivers, men whose villages had been starved in silence. They carried memories no one else could verify, and for that reason they were perfect. He called them innocent only in the sense that their guilt was invisible to others. But to him, they carried the raw material of hidden rage, waiting to be released. In the ledger, one phrase appeared again and again in the margins, written in Latin, written in English, sometimes scratched into the page so hard it tore through the paper. The conductor's method. This was the name he gave to his ritual of breaking patients down. He imagined himself not as a torturer, but as a conductor of an orchestra, guiding each body into the pitch of agony where memory became music. Pain was his baton. Fear was his rhythm. Each cry, each gasp, each whispered confession was a note, and together they formed what he believed to be the true harmony of the human soul. The ledger describes patients as if they were instruments. Plays low, sustains longer under fire, cracks too quickly, needs silence first. The cruelty was not random, it was organized, it was rehearsed. To outsiders, Gray March's victims were fragile and safe, patients meant to live quiet lives under the watch of medicine. But in his mind, they were keys on a hidden organ, each carrying a sound only he could hear. He alone believed he had the skill to play them into their true form. The 27 who vanished were not stolen by chance. They were his chosen choir, gathered for the symphony he was writing in secret, a symphony that could only be heard through their screams. And though the ledger ended in silence, its pages told enough. Every mark, every drawing, every phrase of fractured innocence led deeper into a method that was no longer science and not yet faith, but something older, darker, and waiting. The conductor's method was not only the heart of his work, it was the reason the vanishings would never be solved. Because to Gray March, they were not disappearances at all. They were performances. When Rosewood was finally shuttered decades later and the rooms were cleared, a locked drawer was pried open in what had once been Gray March's private quarters. Inside was a simple glass jar sealed with wax, clouded from age. At first glance it seemed unremarkable, just another container of medical refuse, until the contents were lifted into the light. The jar held 27 human teeth, all of them discolored, some cracked, each marked with carvings so fine they could barely be seen by the naked eye. Under magnification, the carvings revealed themselves as symbols, sharp and deliberate, like writing from a forgotten hand. Scholars who studied the jar later matched the symbols to fragments of a dead language once used in 13th century exorcisms. The words were not prayers, they were instructions, commands etched into enamel as though the tooth itself were meant to carry a curse. Gray March had recorded in his notes that the human body was a cathedral of memory, and that each bone, each nerve, each tooth stored pieces of guilt that could not be erased. The teeth in the jar were not trophies. They were data points in his code, each marked with what he called sins of memory. One bore the symbol for drowning, another for silence, another for betrayal of blood. He believed that carving these marks onto the very fragments of the body fixed the sin in place, preserved it like scripture. The patients were not permitted to forget. They were turned into reliquaries of their own shame. The cruelty of the method was worse than the discovery. Gray March did not remove the teeth under anesthesia. His writings made it clear that consciousness was essential. The tooth was to be taken at the moment of highest fear when the nervous system screamed the loudest. The victim's body had to feel the loss, had to know the sin had been carved into them permanently. To prevent disruption, he used what he called the silence device, a clamp that crushed the vocal cords for hours without killing the patient. Witnesses later wrote that during the nights when he worked, no screams were heard, but faint noises echoed down the corridor. Nurse Elva May, in her surviving journal, described it as singing like insects, 1,000 small throats at once, as if the walls themselves were buzzing. She confessed she could not sleep for days after hearing it, and she wondered aloud if it was the patients humming in forced unison or something else echoing from the instruments themselves. Each tooth in the jar carried not just a symbol but a number scratched into its base. When compared with the red ledger, the numbers matched Gray March's patient entries, linking each tooth to a specific victim. It was a catalog, a grotesque index tying the physical body to the memory he believed he was extracting. In his warped logic, the teeth became external archives of pain, the same way books held knowledge. He wrote that when the body was gone, the teeth would remain, eternal vessels of truth. To him, it was preservation, not mutilation. The most disturbing detail lay in how he arranged them. The teeth were lined in the jar like pieces of a circle, pressed against the glass so that the symbols faced outward. Anyone who held the jar could see the carvings staring back, arranged in sequence as if waiting to be read. Some researchers suggested the arrangement was musical, a kind of notation system tied to his so-called conductor's method. Others believed the sequence was meant to be recited, a litany of memory sins carried forward through the generations. Whatever the intention, the jar itself became an object of unease. Even those who studied it claimed they could hear faint clicks when the room grew quiet, as though the teeth were shifting against one another, continuing the music he had forced into them. The tooth jar proved that Greymarch's work had gone far beyond medicine and into something ritualistic, something ancient he believed he was reviving under the mask of science. The patients were never just bodies to him. They were texts, instruments, tools. Every scream suppressed, every tooth carved, every silence enforced was part of a larger design only he could understand. And with Elva May's disappearance, the last witness to the insect-like singing was gone, leaving behind only the jar to testify to what had been done in the closed wing. And yet it was not the only artifact he left behind. What came next would reveal that even the walls themselves had been forced to remember. For years, room 213 at Rosewood was kept locked without explanation, its door painted over and its number removed from the roster. The records marked it simply as inactive, a word that disguised what had truly been sealed inside. When the asylum was finally decommissioned and the room pried open decades later, investigators stepped into a space that had not breathed fresh air since the winter of the vanishings. What they saw made even seasoned men recoil. Every wall, from floor to ceiling, was covered in fingernail markings, not scattered in panic, but arranged in patterns so deliberate they looked carved by tools. The scratches formed spirals, perfect in their spacing, curling outward like sound waves frozen into plaster. They were not random cries for help. They were equations etched into the walls by a hand consumed with purpose. Experts who examined the spirals realized they carried mathematical precision. Each line maintained its distance from the next, each spiral widened at the same ratio, as though the patient had been guided by a rhythm only they could hear. Some spirals overlapped, forming wave-like intersections that mimicked the diagrams of frequencies used in acoustic studies. When compared against the wax cylinders found in Greymarch's hidden chamber, one spiral matched exactly the frequency pattern of a recorded scream. It was as if the patient had heard the recording and translated its sound into scratches, embedding the agony into the walls. The marks were not simply scars of madness. They were an attempt to transfer suffering into rhythm, to trap it in geometry so it could not be lost. The bed in room 213 was left overturned, its frame rusted, its mattress torn open. Inside the stuffing, investigators found a page torn from a hymnal, but the familiar lines of music had been rewritten. Instead of lyrics of prayer, the page was covered in anatomical instructions. The verses had been replaced with notes on where to cut, where to apply pressure, where to silence the throat without killing the body. The music was gone, replaced with anatomy as liturgy. To whoever had written it, the body itself had become the hymn, the act of breaking it down a form of worship. No one knows who carved the spirals or hid the page. Some believe it was one of the patients driven into methodical obsession by Greymarch's treatments, unable to stop recording the sounds of their own torment in visual form. Others argue that it was Greymarch himself testing whether memory could be transcribed beyond voice, turning pain into patterns that could be played back in silence. The spirals showed no signs of hesitation, no uneven breaks. Whoever made them worked for hours, maybe days, their nails wearing down to blood while the sequence continued without pause. Every mark was an act of precision, not desperation. Psychologists later described the markings as evidence of forced entrainment, a condition where the mind is locked to an external rhythm until it no longer recognizes its own will. The patient had become an instrument, their body a stylus scratching agony into the asylum's walls. Greymarch's obsession with harmony had taken form here, in this single room where pain was arranged into music too faint for human ears but precise enough for those who knew how to measure. Room 213 was resealed after the investigation, the spirals left intact, too disturbing to erase. Photographs were filed away in state archives, rarely viewed, because those who studied them claimed the spirals seemed to move when stared at too long, pulling the eye inward as if the rhythm had never ended. The hymnal page was kept under glass, its instructions blurred by time but still legible enough to remind anyone who read it that prayer had been rewritten into cruelty. Room 213 stood as a monument to what Greymarch believed, that agony was not chaos but order, that screams could be turned into rhythm, that silence could be sculpted into form. And if one room had been marked this way, investigators wondered how many others had been forced to hold their own hidden symphonies. The question lingered in the silence of the asylum's halls, unanswered as the story pressed onward into darker chambers still waiting to be uncovered. Greymarch's most disturbing creation was a technique he called hollowing, a word he used with pride in his journals as if it were a true medical advancement. To him, the human soul was not a mystery but a vessel, a container filled with memory, guilt, and identity. He believed that if the vessel could be emptied, scraped clean of its contents, then it could be refilled with whatever design he wished. The process was not healing, not even punishment. It was erased. Patients became blank slates upon which he could write new stories, new sins, new obediences. Hollowing was both ritual and experiment, and it was carried out with such methodical calm that those who described it later insisted the cruelty was not in the violence itself, but in the stillness with which it was done. The procedure began with the body. Greymarch believed that memory was tied not only to the mind but to the nervous system. He would inject ice water directly into the spinal canal, sending waves of paralysis and cold through the patient's frame. This shock, he argued, opened the gate between body and memory. While the body shivered and seized, he would play hymnals on the phonograph, not as comfort, but as distortion. Because the hymns were recorded backward, their notes twisting into sounds that stripped prayer of meaning. The result was confusion, the collapse of recognition, the sense that nothing familiar could be trusted. He wanted the patient's reality to melt away, leaving them exposed and raw. Once the body was subdued, he turned to the senses. Patients were blinded temporarily with a paste of belladonna rubbed into their eyes, leaving them in a haze of blackness and pain. Sleep deprivation followed, often for days, until they could no longer separate waking from dream. It was at this breaking point that Greymarch would begin interrogation, asking questions not to find answers but to implant them. He would describe crimes they had never committed, betrayals they had never lived, and under the pressure of exhaustion and sensory collapse, the patient would begin to believe. Their voices on his recordings did not sound like testimonies but like confessions dragged out of empty shells. He called this stage induced remorse, the creation of guilt where none had existed. One surviving account tells of a woman who entered Rosewood for simple melancholia. Under Greymarch's hollowing, she emerged believing she had drowned her own child in a river. She wept daily for a son who had never been born, her identity consumed by grief that was planted in her like a seed. She became evidence of his power, a person whose entire memory had been rewritten, whose guilt was manufactured from silence. In his journal, he praised her case as a perfect hollow, a vessel refilled with obedience to sorrow. Hollowing was not an accident of cruelty, but the perfect expression of his philosophy. To Greymarch, pain was not merely useful. It was the only reliable truth. Words could lie, memories could bend, but pain carved deep enough could shape reality itself. If someone could be made to feel remorse for a crime that had never happened, then remorse itself became more real than history. That was his goal, to prove that memory and morality were not fixed but pliable, capable of being tuned like instruments until they sang the notes he desired. The victims of hollowing did not vanish in the traditional sense. They were emptied of themselves while their bodies continued on. Shadows moving in the asylum's halls, alive but no longer their own. It was the purest cruelty, not death, but the theft of self, a form of silence deeper than any grave. And as investigators later traced his patterns, they realized hollowing was not a side practice. It was the center of his work, the heart of his belief that humanity itself could be unmade and remade through ritual suffering. What he left behind was not only broken bodies, but the chilling proof that innocence could be dismantled and guilt could be created from nothing. Hollowing was the name he gave it, but to those who studied the aftermath, another word came to mind: soul murder. And it was only one piece of his growing design, a design that waited to reveal itself in the chapel's shadow. Beneath the chapel of Rosewood, long hidden under warped floorboards and layers of stone, lay a chamber that should never have existed. When workers uncovered it decades after the asylum closed, they expected rot, pipes, or dust. What they found instead was a pit arranged with care, as though it had been crafted not by a builder but by someone rehearsing a ritual. Inside the pit, lit by a shaft of faint daylight through a cracked ceiling beam, were 27 figures kneeling in perfect alignment. At first glance, they appeared to be corpses, their bodies frozen in poses of worship and agony. But closer inspection revealed something stranger, something more deliberate. They were not human. They were mannequins, but mannequins made not of wood or plaster. They were shaped from wax, threaded with blood, and bound together with strands of human hair. Each figure wore a garment taken from a vanished patient, a nightgown, a hospital shirt, a child's torn blanket sewn into clothing. The fabric clung to the wax bodies like skin. Their faces were twisted in silent screams, mouths stretched open to hold objects that made no sense, dried flowers crumbling into dust, rosary beads knotted and forced between the teeth, fragments of bone polished and wedged into jaws. Every mannequin was unique, yet together they formed a grotesque choir, arranged in rows like parishioners kneeling before an altar only Greymarch himself could see. The chamber was not only visual but acoustic. When investigators stepped into the pit, they discovered that every whisper, every shift of air carried across the walls in strange echoes. The room had been tuned like an instrument. Soft footsteps produced low tones overlapping into what sounded like distant Latin prayers. Murmurs became chants, accidental voices layered into words not spoken by the living. It was as though the mannequins themselves were singing, their silent mouths giving shape to sounds hidden in the stone. Some of the echoes matched fragments from Greymarch's phonograph recordings, the same phrases of remorse and confession now trapped in the air of the pit. This was not a coincidence. It was designed. He had built a space where silence itself could be conducted into liturgy. The horror of the mannequins was not only in their form, but in their construction. Chemical analysis showed that the wax was mixed with blood proteins, and the hair used to bind the figures had been pulled directly from human scalps. Some strands still bore roots. It was clear that these were not ordinary mannequins, but effigies woven out of the patients themselves. Their agony had been preserved twice, first in their bodies, then in these replicas that served as grotesque stand-ins for their stolen voices. Each mannequin carried markings on its back, small carvings that matched the symbols found on the teeth jar. The sins of memory had been written again into these figures, embedding each one with the guilt Greymarch believed he had extracted. One mannequin stood out among the rest, Its wax shoulders bore a chain fused into the material, and at the end of the chain was a small necklace, tarnished, but still intact. It matched the description of Nurse Elva May's keepsake, the one she had worn daily before her disappearance. Her necklace was not simply draped onto the effigy, it was melted into its form, as though her identity had been consumed and locked inside. This discovery silenced any doubt that the mannequins were symbolic. They were vessels. Each figure was a patient made into an object, a hollowed shell arranged for the performance of Greymarch's hidden symphony. Those who studied the chamber concluded that the pit was never meant for outside eyes. It was Greymarch's private congregation, a choir sculpted from silence. By placing the effigies beneath the chapel directly under the altar, he inverted the sacred into the profane, creating a sanctuary where worship was agony and prayer was preserved through mutilation. He did not destroy his patients outright. He transformed them, forcing their remnants into this grotesque order, their silence tuned into echoes that would outlive their bodies. The choir pit remains one of the most haunting discoveries tied to Rosewood, not because of what was seen, but because of what was heard. Investigators swore that even when the chamber was empty, the mannequins continued to whisper in the faintest tones, phrases in Latin no one could fully translate. The sound had no source, no origin, only the weight of memory carried through air. Some called it hallucination. Others believed it was proof that Greymarch had succeeded in his goal, that he had taken human agony and turned it into something eternal. And when the chamber was resealed, it was not for preservation, but for fear. Because those who stood too long in the choir pit said the whispers grew louder, not fainter, until it felt as if the mannequins were no longer only singing, but listening. And above them in the chapel that still carried Greymarch's shadow, the next stage of his design was waiting. The final days of Greymarch at Rosewood were not recorded in official ledgers, but in fragments of rumor, scraps of memory, and one chilling line left behind in his own hand. In a leather-bound journal tucked between drawings of spinal cords and notations on pain, his last entry read simply, "They are silent now, but their echoes will teach the next. No date, no signature. Only the closing of a chapter that suggested he believed his work complete. To him, the vanishings, the mannequins, the tooth jar, the spirals etched into walls were not crimes but lessons. Rehearsals for a truth larger than Rosewood itself. It was a sermon written not in words but in bodies, conducted in the silence of winter and meant to continue beyond the asylum's gates. Days after this entry, he disappeared. His quarters were left in a state both orderly and violated. On his desk, instruments had been cleaned and stacked neatly, glass jars polished, papers arranged in rows. Yet the room carried signs of ritual undoing. In the corner, the small statue of Saint Dymphna, patron saint of the mentally afflicted, had been beheaded. The head was never found, but the body remained propped upright, a mocking shrine to broken protection. His bed was stripped bare, the sheets missing, and the wardrobe empty of clothes. Only one item remained, placed with deliberate care on the chapel steps. His winter coat, folded as though for burial, lined with dried blood. Some said the blood was his, others swore it was too dark, too thick, as though drained from another body. No one ever proved either. Rumors spread quickly in the weeks that followed. Some staff claimed they saw him moving through the corridors long after his disappearance was reported, his lantern flickering in places no one else dared go. Others whispered that he had slipped through the storm and boarded a train west under a false name, vanishing into the sprawl of America where institutions welcomed anyone with credentials and a steady voice. The most unsettling account came from a priest who claimed to have heard Greymarch's confession in a station confessional years later. The man's voice, he said, was calm, without tremor, and his words were simple. I taught the devil silence. The priest never saw his face, but swore the weight of the words matched the rumors of Rosewood's vanished doctor. The chapel itself became a monument to his absence. The pit below remained undiscovered at that time, but the echoes above were already felt. Parishioners who attempted to hold service there after the storm described hearing faint whispers beneath their prayers, as if another congregation still knelt below repeating their own hymn of agony. The folded coat remained on the steps for months before someone finally removed it, though the stain of blood stayed in the stone. The staff avoided the chapel after dark, claiming the air felt heavier there, as if the walls were listening. It was said that his journal entry had not been written for himself but for the building, that he believed the asylum itself had become an instrument tuned to carry his lessons forward. Investigators who later pieced together his story noted the precision of his exit. Greymarch did not flee in panic. He departed with method, as if the vanishings, the recordings, the mannequins, and the spirals were a complete composition. He left behind symbols, not evidence. He left behind silence that could not be cross-examined. The folded coat was a signature, a final gesture of order in the chaos he had created, an assurance that he had chosen his end rather than had it forced upon him. And yet the absence of his body, the rumors of travel, the whispered confession suggested otherwise. He may not have ended at Rosewood, he may have only begun. The winter sermon, as scholars later called it, was not preached from a pulpit. It was enacted in mutilation, in erasure, in silence turned into structure. Greymarch believed he had taught silence to speak, to echo beyond the lives he took. His disappearance became part of that design. By leaving without closure, he left the world to wonder, to whisper, to continue his work in memory and rumor. And that was the truest cruelty of all. For in silence he was no longer just a doctor or a criminal. He became a shadow that could never be caught, a lesson that could never be forgotten. And as Rosewood sank deeper into decay, the next discovery of his doctrine would prove that his silence had indeed survived. In 1924, more than 20 years after the vanishings at Rosewood, a strange manuscript began to circulate in quiet circles of psychology and philosophy. It carried no author's name. Only the title, The Doctrine of Harmonic Memory, written in faded ink across its cover. Yet anyone familiar with Greymarch's journals recognized the handwriting immediately. The slanted script, the precise sketches, the obsession with rhythm and silence. It was his voice carried forward in pages meant never to reach the public. The book appeared first in Paris, then in Berlin, then in private collections across South America and Eastern Europe. It was passed by hand, whispered about in universities and banned whenever discovered. But the damage was already done. His ideas had survived, sharpened, and were now feeding minds desperate for control. The manuscript proposed a theory that disturbed even the most radical thinkers of the time. Greymarch wrote that guilt was not abstract, not merely emotional or spiritual, but a physical condition stored in the nervous system. He described guilt as a scar, a residue etched into nerves and tissues, hidden from the eye but alive in the body. To him, the human frame was a living archive of every moral failure, every betrayal, every unspeakable act. He claimed the body carried these scars long after the mind had forgotten them, and that by striking the right nerve through pain and sound, the scar could be awakened and forced to confess. He called this the harmonic principle, the idea that suffering had a frequency and that each person's hidden guilt could be played like music until it bled out. The diagrams in the manuscript were not abstract. They showed bodies stripped and restrained, marked with lines that traced pathways from throat to spine, from ear to heart, from teeth to brain. Each pathway was labeled as a guilt vein. Alongside them were architectural sketches of chambers with curved walls and tuned ceilings designed to amplify screams into echoes that would circle endlessly back into the victim's ears. These drawings were not theory. They were blueprints for torture chambers arranged like instruments, rooms where human agony could be conducted as sound. The most chilling of these diagrams resembled the choir pit found decades later, proving that his visions had not been confined to Rosewood alone. Academic circles recoiled. Mainstream institutions denounced the manuscript as dangerous pseudoscience, a perversion of psychology. It was banned in France, burned in Germany, and locked in archives in London. But in the shadows it thrived. Radical thinkers in Argentina and Russia took its ideas seriously. Secret experiments were carried out on prisoners and political dissidents, searching for the scars Grey March had promised, testing whether induced pain could rewrite memory, and whether silence could be used as a weapon to break men without leaving visible marks. His doctrine offered something seductive to authoritarian minds, a science of control that went deeper than the body into the soul itself. One surviving page, copied and preserved when most were destroyed, carried a line that became infamous. The body forgets what the soul screams. It was his creed, his justification, the sentence that explained why his patients at Rosewood had been chosen, hollowed and transformed. To him, the body could be silenced, the mind erased, but the soul would never stop screaming. And those screams could be captured, tuned, and used as proof. That was the legacy he left in ink. A manual not of healing but of manipulation, a doctrine that made agony eternal. The appearance of the doctrine of harmonic memory confirmed what many had feared. Grey March had not ended with Rosewood. He had carried his silence into the world, hidden behind the mask of scholarship, offering his method to anyone willing to listen. And in the years that followed, whispers of his work appeared wherever institutions had reason to erase lives quietly. Rosewood had been only the first sermon. The doctrine was the scripture, and what came after would show just how far silence could travel once it had been taught to sing. By 1972, Rosewood was no longer a hospital but a carcass of stone, its windows broken, its halls collapsing under mildew and dust. The state closed it quietly, without ceremony, and the order was written in the cold language of budget and safety. But the true reason lingered in whispers. The building had carried too much silence for too long. Families of the 27 who vanished never received answers. Their questions faded into generations, their grief absorbed but never resolved. When a small group proposed a memorial, the request was denied without explanation, as though even a plaque of names might unseal what the state had fought to bury. Survivors who left Rosewood carried strange memories they could not shake. They spoke of vanishing corridors that seemed endless one moment and gone the next, and of nights when the windows disappeared, leaving only black walls where light should have been. Officials dismissed their testimonies as madness, but when enough of them described the same details, the silence became more unsettling than the words themselves. In the town archive, a locked cabinet still holds a box labeled Unclaimed. Inside are 27 files unmarked, their pages nearly empty. Each one contains only a name and a stamped word. Missing. No transfer forms, no deaths recorded, no closure. A letter from a law clerk written during the final closure captured the truth better than any record. Some places are sealed by more than doors, he wrote. Rosewood is one of them. That single line remains the closest thing to an admission the state ever allowed. And so the asylum's legacy was not justice, not remembrance, but silence, an absence heavier than any stone still waiting to be broken. Evil rarely survives through violence alone. It survives in silence, in paperwork filed away, in officials who look down and convince themselves that omission is not complicity. Grey March was one man, but the silence around him was built by many. He thrived because institutions prefer quiet to scandal, because they would rather bury pain than face it. Rosewood's records were sealed, its corridors abandoned, and its victims turned into whispers. No tribunal, no memorial, no admission. The absence of truth became the ground in which his legacy rooted itself. Institutions then as now hide behind the mask of normalcy. Reports are stamped and signed. Words like transfer or treatment replace the brutality of what really happened. It is easier to call cruelty science, easier to call suffering progress, easier to call silence peace. This is how Grey March's method did not end with him. It bled forward through systems that were willing to adopt his ideas without naming them, through doctors who dismissed conscience as weakness, through states that saw erasure as efficiency. His evil did not need his hands to continue. It only needed others to look away. The truth is that atrocities are rarely the work of a single mind. They are networks of silence, threads of denial that hold everything in place. Grey March carved his lessons into flesh, but the world around him preserved them by refusing to speak. In that refusal, he was never punished, never remembered by law, only by fear. His silence became theirs. His doctrine became a rumor. His shadow stretched not because he was powerful, but because others chose not to break it. And so, even now, institutions echo the same rhythm. They smile in daylight, promise care, hide what cannot be spoken. Evil survives in that space between what is seen and what is admitted. Grey March may have vanished, but his silence lives on, buried in files, whispered in hallways, repeated every time a voice is ignored. And the question remains, heavy and unbroken: what do you think? Could this happen again?